It was Thanksgiving. The candles were flickering in the restaurant. The table was loaded with a feast. And sitting around me were the people I was supposed to trust above anyone else in the world. Then a stranger knocked on my door. He was soaked through, shivering in the bone-chilling sleet of a Michigan November, his eyes carrying nothing but a quiet, watchful stillness. He was just asking for a place to stay warm. My son-in-law told me to turn him away, and he did it with a sharp, commanding tone. I didn't. I pulled out a chair and handed him a plate. That one simple choice changed everything, because the man sitting at the end of my table that night would eventually pull the thread that unraveled every single scheme my daughter and son-in-law had spent 7 months carefully crafting. And the cost for them, well, it was heavy. This is a story about patience, about family, and about the weight of what it actually means to protect the ones you love. There's a specific kind of silence in a car restoration shop after closing time. It isn't an empty, dead silence. It's more like the steel, the leather, and the oil are holding their breath. The overhead industrial lights are off, but the glow from the street lamps filters through the dusty windows, hitting those polished chrome bumpers and reflecting a cold, sharp color that feels like it belongs to another century. I've been listening to this silence for nearly 50 years, and I'm still not tired of it. My name is Arthur Pendleton. I'm 71, and I'm a restorer. I'm not talking about some guy running a corner shop who fools people with cheap parts and computer diagnostic codes. I'm talking about old-school craftsmanship, the kind where you put your hand on a rusted Ford V8, listen to the rattle as it turns over, and know exactly whether that heart is worth saving before any machine tells you so. I learned this the hard way. Most things worth knowing have to be earned in the dim light, with aching muscles, and under the eye of a mentor who didn't believe in shortcuts. For 45 years, Pendleton Classics has been tucked away in Corktown, Detroit. When we first moved into this red brick building, Corktown wasn't the neighborhood of boutique coffee shops and craft breweries it is today. Back then, it was just abandoned warehouses, rusted tracks, and blue-collar folks who knew how to mind their own business. Then, the city had its revival. High-end apartments went up, and those trendy restaurants serving $100 steaks moved in. But we stayed. The peeling sign out front has been repainted 3 times, but the name has never changed. Nowadays, it's just me and Smith. Smith has been working the front desk in the parts room for 22 years. He's 68 now, moving a bit slower, but he still insists on wearing that faded Detroit Tigers cap and a crisp, clean uniform every single day. I once asked him why he bothered, and he said, "Mr. Pendleton, our clients don't leave us their grandfather's car just to watch an old man give up on his own dignity." I didn't have an answer for him then. I still don't. The shop doesn't look like much from the street, but it's a world of its own inside. 4 wide bays, a dust-free back room for engine rebuilds, a tiny office I haven't really organized since 2019, and a walnut rocking chair in the corner by the window, always angled slightly toward the wall. That chair has been there for 30 years. For most of that time, it belonged to Martha. My wife passed away in the early fall of 2022. Ovarian cancer. It came on fast and showed no mercy, which is usually how these things go. Afterward, people would ask me how I was holding up, and I'd always say, "I'm doing okay." Because what else can you say? The truth is hard to put into words. It wasn't exactly sadness, at least not the kind of sobbing people expect. It felt more like walking into a room and realizing the main light on the ceiling had burnt out. Everything was still there, and you could still see, but the quality of the light had changed entirely. And every time you opened your eyes, you felt the absence of that light. I kept the chair. Now it belongs to Maya. She's 12, my daughter Eleanor's child. Every Tuesday and Thursday she walks over from middle school, drops her heavy cello case with a loud thud next to the chair, a sound that always makes Smith wince, and spends 2 hours focused on her sketches and homework. She doesn't talk much while she works, neither do I. Over the last year, we've developed a rhythm. She does her thing, I do mine, and somewhere in the middle, Smith silently brings us both a warm apple cider. Maya has the exact same eyes as Martha, I've never told her that. Some things you just keep to yourself. It was a Tuesday afternoon in early June, with that miserable, half-hearted, freezing rain coming down over Detroit. I was thinking about Maya, the chair, and the way time slips by, when the bell on the roll-up door chimed. Vance walked in. My son-in-law is 39. He wears perfectly tailored Italian suits and works in venture capital and commercial real estate across the river, in Troy. That's a fancy way of saying his job is to convince people that empty assets are worth way more than they really are. He's very good at it. He's always been good at making things look like something they're not. He walked in around 4:30. Maya was buried in her sketchbook, and Smith was doing what he'd done 1,000 times before, slowly polishing the front fender of a 1969 Mustang. Vance said hello to Smith, ruffled Maya's hair in that distracted, superficial way people do when they aren't really present, and drifted into my workspace. I stood by the engine stand and watched him. In 50 years in this business, you learn to spot a certain kind of look. People who truly love classic cars get close. They slow down. Their eyes land on a body line or a carburetor like they're settling into a comfortable chair. But some people walk through that door and they aren't looking at cars at all. They're calculating. You can tell by the way their gaze moves, not from one part to another, but from one workstation to the next, from one cabinet of tools to another. It's an inventory. That's how Vance walked through the shop. I'd seen that same look at bankruptcy auctions before. He mentioned he happened to be in the neighborhood, said he hadn't stopped by in a while, and wanted to check in. He asked how the business was doing, asked if I'd had any new thoughts on the retirement plan I'd mentioned in March, and asked if Smith was still on the full-time payroll. All normal questions asked in a normal tone, with that professional smile that stays on the face for just half a second too long. I answered him the way I always do, calm, vague, giving away nothing. It's a skill I learned from years in business. If people think you aren't guarding anything, they're much faster to show their own hand. After about 15 minutes, he said he had to get back downtown for a meeting. He gave Maya a slightly more sincere pat on the shoulder, shook Smith's hand, and walked out the door. A FedEx truck rumbled past on the street outside. Maya didn't look up from her drawing. I walked back into my office, sat down, and opened a small black notebook that had been in the top left drawer since the fall of 2022. I started it a week after Martha's memorial, when I realized I needed a place to put the things that couldn't be said out loud. As time went on, it turned into something else, a record. Dates, observations, all those little things that seem meaningless on their own. But when you write them down and look at them over time, they start to form a pattern. I wrote the date, June 3rd, 2025. Then I wrote, V came by looking at the shop with the wrong eyes again, asking about retirement. I closed the notebook and looked out the window. Detroit was doing what Detroit does best in early summer, creating a gray haze that you can't tell is rain or mist, covering the streets in a dead silver light. A woman walked by with a golden retriever. A cyclist swerved around a illegally parked delivery truck. A normal Tuesday afternoon. There was no sign that anything was wrong. For 50 years, I've been learning how to see things that other people miss. I just never thought I'd have to use that skill on my own daughter and son-in-law. Things started small, as they usually do. A hot drink I didn't ask for, accompanied by a smile I didn't quite trust. Eleanor was never a particularly affectionate daughter. She wasn't cold exactly. She was just the kind of person who carefully maintained a certain distance. She'd remember your birthday with a card, and that was it. She'd ask how you were, but never stop to listen to the answer. For 17 years, ever since she left for college, we'd existed in a polite, almost avoidant relationship. She stayed on her track. I stayed on mine. It's a setup common in many American families, not because it's healthy, but because no one wants to be the one to break the balance. So when she started showing up at the shop frequently in early July, I noticed. The first time, she seemed to have a reasonable excuse. She said she was at the boutique furniture store 2 blocks away and decided to stop in. She brought a hot hibiscus tea in a paper cup from the corner shop. She knew I'd given up black coffee years ago because of my heart. She set the tea on the edge of my workbench with a smile that felt like stage lighting. Technically flawless, but you knew the source was artificial. I thanked her. I wrapped my hands around the cup. I didn't drink it. We talked for about 20 minutes. She asked about Maya, how school was going, and if she was still coming by the shop after class. She asked about Smith, if his arthritis was any better. All the right questions in the right order, with just enough concern to sound real. I answered them all. I watched her the same way I'd watch an engine block I wasn't sure was cracked on the inside. Not by staring, just by focusing and feeling. She left without asking for anything. That wasn't strange. The strange part was that she came back 4 days later. This time it was a high-end thermos, filled with a special herbal blend. She carefully poured it into my ceramic mug on the shelf, one Martha had brought back from a trip to Vermont in 2014, one I'd never had the heart to put away. That kind of attention to detail was intentional. I recognized the move for what it was: reconnaissance. Eleanor had been observing, filing things away, and now she was using what she'd learned. The tea was aromatic, I'll give it that, but there was an undertone I couldn't quite place. It wasn't exactly unpleasant, but it had a presence that didn't belong in a simple herbal blend. It was slightly bitter, like the taste of synthetic minerals, or that lingering sensation some prescription meds leave at the back of your throat. I took 2 small sips, set the mug down, and quietly moved it to the far end of my workbench. That afternoon, she started asking about the shop's commercial bank account. She set the stage very carefully. I was starting to notice that she always set the stage carefully now. The topic was wrapped in a story about a friend, someone whose elderly father had ended up in the hospital unexpectedly, only for them to find themselves in a bind regarding access to his funds. "I just think we should be prepared, Dad," she said. "If we added someone to your account to help manage things, it would be one less thing to worry about if an emergency ever came up." She said it like a line she'd rehearsed a dozen times. It was too smooth, no hesitation, no searching for the right words. People who are truly speaking out of genuine concern usually stumble a bit. They weigh their words. Eleanor didn't trip over a single syllable. I told her it was a kind suggestion and that I'd think about it. I used a tone that made it clear I didn't think it was a good idea, and had no intention of thinking about it at all. Vance had been changing at the same time, though in a different way. He didn't come to the shop much, but he started calling 3 times in the first 2 weeks of July, which was more than he'd called in the entire month of June combined. The conversations followed a set pattern. He'd ask about my health, then the business, and 2/3 of the way through, he'd pivot to the real topic: retirement. Specifically, he'd ask if I'd given any serious thought to simplifying my life, if I'd spoken to a financial advisor recently, and since I wasn't getting any younger, if I'd considered bringing in a professional team to handle the administration and financials. Since you're not getting any younger. He used that casual tone every single time, as if it were just an objective observation rather than a way to apply pressure. In 45 years of buying, selling, and negotiating, I've dealt with enough Wall Street types and slick car dealers to know exactly when someone is probing for a weakness. You say something in a neutral tone enough times, and eventually, it doesn't sound like a threat anymore. Eventually, it just sounds like common sense. I let him talk. I agreed it was worth thinking about. Then I'd move the conversation to Maya's upcoming fall semester, which Vance was always happy to talk about because it made him feel like a good stepfather. When the timing felt right, I'd end the call. After hanging up, I'd sit at my workbench and think about what an old-timer told me when I was 23. I was still learning how to tell the difference between a piece of real, high-quality steel and junk that had just been polished to look good. "Arthur," he told me, "in this business, the most dangerous person isn't the client who insults you to your face. It's the jerk who won't stop complimenting you." I thought about that for a long time. Then I picked up my pen. I didn't write down every conversation, only the ones that felt off afterward, the ones that left a residue. I wrote down Eleanor's comment about the bank account and the exact phrasing she used. I wrote down Vance's retirement remarks and the dates of the calls. I wrote about the taste of that tea, not as an accusation, just as a detail, a part that I wasn't sure about yet, something to set aside for closer inspection. By the 3rd week of July, Eleanor had been to the shop 5 times. Each visit included something. tea, pastries from the French bakery 2 blocks over, and once a classic car magazine she thought I'd like. Each visit also included a question, not always about money or property. Sometimes they were softer, asking if I'd thought about what would happen to the shop eventually, asking if I had plans for the inventory, or if I'd updated any important wills or medical directives lately. Living to 71 gives you enough time to learn something that schools don't teach and families rarely discuss. People who want something from you almost never ask for it directly. They move close to you first. They make themselves useful. They build a sense of presence, a habit, a feeling of trust that makes you feel indebted to them. And then, once the foundation is laid, they start building on top of it. I knew what they were building, I just didn't know how high they intended to go. On the last Friday in July, Eleanor arrived with tea again, the same thermos, the same mug, the same smile. She poured it herself, set it in front of me, and we talked for 20 minutes about nothing of importance. When she left, I sat alone in the back room and picked up that mug. The bitterness was there again, weak but steady. If you weren't specifically looking for it, or if you completely trusted the person handing you the cup, you would have missed it. I set the mug down and looked at the sediment at the bottom. In the afternoon light coming through the back window against the white ceramic, there was a faint, dark ring. For the first time in a very long time, I felt a cold chill run through me. I found the thing on a Thursday. It wasn't by accident. I'd been looking, though I didn't admit that to myself until my hand touched the bottle. Eleanor had left her coat behind. She'd been in that morning for about 30 minutes, bringing a pot of soup instead of tea this time. She'd carefully asked 3 questions about whether I'd contacted an estate lawyer lately, then rushed out, saying she had a meeting for an acquisition on the other side of town. Her coat was hanging on a stool by my workbench. I stared at the coat for half an hour before deciding to act. I went back to work, finished a carburetor rebuild, wrote up 2 estimates, and talked to Smith about a back-ordered part. A normal afternoon, except every 20 minutes or so, my eyes would drift to that coat hanging on the stool like a question I hadn't decided whether to answer yet. At 4:15, Smith said goodnight, adjusted his tiger's cap, and headed home. I locked the front door, flipped the sign, and stood in that particular stillness that follows the end of a workday. I walked over and checked the pockets. The left pocket had a folded dry cleaning receipt and half a pack of mints. The right pocket had a phone charger, a tube of lip balm, and a small 2-inch brown glass bottle. It had a black plastic cap with no commercial label, just a strip of white medical tape wrapped around the middle, with handwriting that was either incredibly small or incredibly rushed. The ink was a bit smudged, as if the cap had been tightened before the writing was dry. I held the bottle in my palm and didn't move for a long time. People often expect anger in moments like this, but I didn't feel anger. I felt something cleaner, a cold and precise clarity. It was the exact same feeling I had when I finally discovered a fatal rust-through on a chassis I'd hoped to perfectly restore. You don't get mad at a flaw, you just see it. You accept that it's there, and then you decide what to do next. There was still a sample of the tea from the previous Friday in the back room. I poured it into a small, sealed glass jar and tucked it behind a box of electrical tape, a place no one would think to look. I placed the jar next to the little bottle on my workbench, and in the evening twilight, the 2 objects sat side by side, like the beginning of a sentence I hadn't finished reading. I thought about calling the police. Then I dismissed the idea. Going to the police now with 2 containers and a suspicion would only achieve one thing. It would tell Vance and Eleanor that I already knew. Whatever they were planning, I didn't have the full picture. How many people were involved, how long they'd been at it, or how far they intended to push things. Acting too soon would hand the advantage of, I know, right over to them. Before I gave anything to anyone, I needed more leverage. I pulled an old-school Yellow Pages directory from the bottom drawer of my desk, a physical book, not a website. I wasn't about to use any electronic device tied to my name to search for an independent testing lab. I found what I needed on page 3 under Analysis and Testing Labs. It was a small independent agency in Ann Arbor that took private commissions and kept results confidential. No personal identity verification needed. I wrote the address and phone number on a scrap of paper, not in my notebook. I kept it folded in my shirt pocket, and it didn't go anywhere else. At 4:53 p.m., I called from the shop's landline. The man who answered was brief and professional. Organic compound analysis, 8 to 10 business days, $140, cash upon delivery. Tracking by number only, no names attached to samples. I booked a time for the following morning, confirmed the address, and said thank you. After hanging up, I carefully wrapped both containers in a clean rag and placed them in my jacket's inside breast pocket. I locked the front door, locked the office, and drove home without turning on the radio. I didn't go to the kitchen, and I didn't sit in the armchair in the living room where I usually spent an hour after work. I went straight upstairs to the small room at the end of the hall, Martha's study. I hadn't moved a thing in there since the spring of 2022. Her reading chair was still angled toward the window, her lamp was still on the side table, and that 2018 photo from our last trip before everything changed was still on the shelf. I sat on a wooden chair moved from the hallway. I didn't sit in her chair. I never would. I started talking to her. At first, my voice was light. Then it lowered until it was just soft enough not to carry through the door. I told her what I'd found. I told her what I thought it meant. I told her that until I understood the whole picture, I wouldn't move a muscle, because taking the wrong step now would be worse than doing nothing at all. Martha never had patience for indecision that masqueraded as caution, but she understood the difference better than anyone I knew. Real caution is backed by a plan. Hesitation is just fear that's dressed up nicely. I wasn't afraid. I didn't know how deep the plan went or what they intended to take from me, but I knew what I had to do next, the same way I always knew the disassembly and reassembly an engine needed to find its roar again. You find the fault, you prepare, and when the time is right, you give it everything you've got. From tonight on, I couldn't let my guard down for a second. The results came back on a Tuesday. I read them twice, folded the paper once along the crease, and tucked it into the false bottom of my workbench drawer. The same place where I'd hidden Martha's engagement ring for 3 weeks, until I finally worked up the nerve to propose. Some things you hide not because they're shameful, but because they're too important to be exposed to the air. The report was 4 pages long, written in the dry, precise language of people who only deal with facts and have no interest in your personal vendettas. The summary was on the first page. The compounds identified in both samples were well-documented central nervous system depressants, specifically a mixture of a powerful benzodiazepine and a type of hypnotic medication. The impact on short-term memory processing in the elderly looked almost indistinguishable from early-stage cognitive impairment, pre-Alzheimer's. If used consistently over a few months, the effects would be subtle, appearing perfectly natural. If carefully documented by a physician who had been tipped off on what to look for, these symptoms would create a perfect clinical record. A clinical record that could be used in court to justify stripping a man of his legal capacity to manage his own affairs, a conservatorship. I sat and processed it for a long time. Then I stood up, walked to the sink in the back room, and washed my hands with the calm thoroughness of a man who had just finished a difficult task. Then I went back to work. That afternoon I started practicing. I started small, picking up the wrong tool from the workbench, looking at it with a moment of confusion and putting it back down. Asking Smith what day of the week it was, even though I knew perfectly well. Pausing mid-sentence as if the next word had slipped out of my mind. No dramatic performance, nothing that would look forced if you stared at it. It was just simulating the texture of a mind slowly losing its grip on the edges of things. I'd spent 50 years training my eyes to spot the almost imperceptible mechanical faults. It turned out the same precision worked in reverse. I practiced at home in the bathroom mirror at night. I needed to treat this as a technical problem, not a personal humiliation. I needed to learn how to do something I'd never done before, convincingly. It required practice, just like learning how to hand hammer a perfectly curved body panel years ago. Any skill worth having requires repetition before it becomes reliable. But I hadn't anticipated the cost of the practice. The second week of August, on a Thursday, Vance came by. He was in a great mood, actually more relaxed than he'd been in months, which told me how well he thought things were going. We talked for a while about Maya's upcoming school year, the restoration work I was finishing on a Porsche 356, and random odds and ends. At one point, the conversation drifted naturally to Martha. I pretended I couldn't remember the name of the restaurant where we'd celebrated her last birthday. It was an old Italian place on Woodward Avenue that she'd loved for years. Details like that are usually etched into your soul, not just your memory, like something you've carried for so long. I let my eyes go a little unfocused. I said something like, "That Italian place, the one on the west side. She always ordered the same dish." Then, with a slight frown of effort that went nowhere, I let my voice trail off. Vance provided the name of the restaurant. I said, Right, of course, that's the one." And I nodded, performing like a man who'd just received information rather than a man who had known the answer all along. He quickly changed the subject. People are always like that when they get the confirmation they're looking for, but I hadn't anticipated the feeling that hit me in my chest during those 4 seconds. It wasn't exactly sadness. I'd made peace with sadness over the last 3 years. It was something else. It felt like a small, precise betrayal. Betrayal of a private contract I didn't even know I was keeping. Keeping Martha's name on my lips as a prop in a farce she'd never have asked me to play. After Vance left, I stood at my workbench for a long time. Then I picked up my tools and finished the work I had in front of me. Every time something like this happened, that's how I handled it. The feeling was sharp and sudden, and I let it pass through me without slowing my work. You can't stop in the middle of grinding an engine head just because the work is harder than you expected. You adjust your grip and keep going. Eleanor's tea visits continued throughout August. Every time I went through the routine, accept the warm drink, wrap my hands around it, exchange pleasantries, and then when the conversation shifted or Eleanor turned away, tip the cup toward the poor pothos plant in the corner of the workbench. I'd had that plant for 11 years. It had survived droughts, neglect, and 2 moves, but by the end of August it was looking visibly terminal. I felt bad about that. Maya noticed that something was different. She came in on a Tuesday afternoon, dropped her cello as usual, and sat in the chair to start her homework. About 40 minutes later, without looking up from her notebook, she suddenly said, "Grandpa, what are you practicing?" I turned to look at her. "What do you mean?" "You keep doing that thing," she said. "You stop and look like you've forgotten something, but you haven't. You immediately go right back to whatever you were doing." 12 years old, Martha's eyes, and as it turned out, she'd inherited her grandmother's terrifying intuition radar, too. I thought for a moment. Then I said, "I'm practicing remembering." She looked at me with that expression children have when they suspect an adult is telling the truth, in a way they aren't supposed to fully understand. Then she looked down and went back to her homework. Practicing remembering. It was the most honest thing I'd said to anyone in weeks. By the end of August, the act had almost become second nature. Vance and Eleanor saw what they expected to see, a man whose edges were softening, a man whose grip on the details of his life was quietly slipping. They were building their case on the foundation I'd helped them lay, which also meant I knew every brick in that foundation. Some nights after closing, I'd sit at the workbench with my hands flat in front of me, palms down, a habit I'd picked up as an apprentice. Back then, absolute stability of the hands was a job requirement. A tremor at the wrong time could ruin a week's worth of work. My hands were steady. Every time, both hands were rock steady. That was enough. As long as that was true, I was still in control of the only thing that mattered. Someone needed to confirm the symptoms, a doctor. And knowing Vance's methods, that part had clearly been arranged a long time ago. September always makes me think of Elias. I don't know exactly why. Maybe it's the light. Detroit in September has a quality, a low amber glow that slants in through the west-facing windows, making everything look older than it really is. The re-chromed bumpers catch a different luster in this light than in the summer, less dazzling, more profound, like they're being asked a completely different question. Elias always had a way with words about things like this. He always did. I met him in the winter of 1974. I was 23, fresh from a small town in northern Michigan, and I knew nothing about real mechanical engineering beyond taking apart tractors. I had some talent, but no systematic training. I saw a handwritten sign in the window of the shop he ran in Pontiac. Apprentice wanted. Must have patience. Pay is meager. The last part proved to be an extreme understatement. When I started working for Elias, he was 57. That means in those early photos I still keep, he was the same age I am now. Looking at a man who was an old man in your memory and realizing he was younger than you are today is a very strange experience. It reconfigures the way you think about time. He was a sturdy man with unhurried movements, and those hands seemed to operate independently from the rest of his body. While he talked, gestured, argued, and did everything else, his work stayed steady and precise. He had opinions on everything and never apologized for sharing them. He also had a special gift. You often didn't understand what he was saying until 3 years later. One afternoon in my first month, I was struggling with a carburetor synchronization, and I couldn't get it right. I asked him, since the client probably wouldn't feel the difference of 100 PMs, why it had to be perfect. He put down his work, looked at me for a while, and said, "A truly great engine doesn't need to scream. It just needs to be placed exactly where the ignition timing is perfect. The road will give you the answer for the rest." I went home and wrote that down. I've thought about it on most days since then. He taught me everything about the work, not just the technical side, though he was incredibly demanding there, but more importantly, the stuff underneath: patience, the willingness to tolerate an incomplete, imperfect piece, rather than rushing it before it's ready. The understanding that what a machine can eventually become is always more important than the pile of scrap you found it as. We worked together for 9 years. Then I opened this shop. Time did what time does. It moved forward fast, taking everything with it. Elias and I stayed in touch, the way you stay in touch with people you intend to see often, but always break your word to. A Christmas card, an occasional phone call, a visit every year or two that was always too short. When I left his shop, he had a nephew, maybe 8 years old, quiet and alert, the kind of kid who listened more than he spoke. I don't remember much else about him. I didn't pay enough attention back then. That's a guilt I had to live with later. Around 1998, Elias hit a major financial crisis. The details aren't for me to recount. It probably involved a partner who proved untrustworthy and a series of decisions made with good intentions that triggered a catastrophic chain reaction. He called me twice that year. I remember the content of both calls clearly, which in itself is a self-indictment. I was busy expanding my shop, burdened with loans myself, managing employees for the first time. I listened. I said the things you're supposed to say, but I didn't do the one thing that could have truly helped him. I didn't go see him myself. Elias's shop closed in 2000. He passed away in the spring of 2002. I found out 2 weeks after the fact from a mutual friend. I sent flowers to an address I wasn't even sure was still his. I told myself that we hadn't been close in a long time and that after so many years, nothing I did would change the outcome. But I never really believed those excuses. On a shelf in my back workshop, behind a row of heavy mechanical manuals and a little desk lamp I'd always meant to replace, there's a box. In the box, wrapped in dark velvet, is an extremely rare original 1967 Shelby GT 500 tachometer. The face is covered in scratches and the needle is stuck. Elias gave it to me in the summer of 2001, a few months after his shop closed, about a year before he passed. He'd put it in a brown paper bag and placed it on my workbench with zero ceremony. "I don't have time to fix it," he said. "When you're ready, you finish it." I asked him what it needed. He said, "When you can look at it with the right eyes, you'll know." I'd looked at it with the right eyes many times. I'd taken it out of the box, put it under a magnifying glass, and made notes on the internal gears, the hairspring, and the brass parts that needed fine-tuning. I knew exactly what it needed, and I knew how to go about it. But I never took it apart. I can't fully explain why, except to say that some things accumulate a weight over time that has nothing to do with physical mass. That dashboard gauge represented something I hadn't earned the right to complete yet. A conversation I owed Elias. A conversation I'd delayed for 23 years, always telling myself there was more time, and that I'd do it when I was ready. My whole September was like most Septembers I'd lived, working, observing, maintaining the performance. Vance called twice. I handled it without a ripple. Eleanor stopped by with her thermos 3 more times. I handled those the same way. Took a small sip, then poured it for the pothos plant that was definitely failing. On a Thursday afternoon at the end of the month, one of those cold, damp days Detroit pours out after the summer's brief rain ends, Eleanor walked in saying she wanted to drop off a handwritten stew recipe because I'd mentioned liking that dish. She stayed for 20 minutes, spending most of it near the front door with her back to me, talking on the phone. I was in the back room, close enough to hear, but far enough away that she clearly forgot I was there. She was speaking to someone in a lowered voice, the kind people use when they want to sound normal, but can't quite pull it off. Most of it was mundane, but at the end, just before she wrapped up the call, she mentioned a name. Julian. Just the name. No context, no explanation, followed by a sentence about next week, and then a sentence I couldn't quite make out. When she said the last part, she lowered her voice even further, whether intentionally or by instinct, I couldn't tell. A minute later, she returned to the back room in high spirits, handed me the recipe card, and left after 5 more minutes. After she left, I stood at my workbench, looking at the box with Elias's tachometer behind the books on the shelf. 23 years. I hadn't touched it once. I opened my notebook and wrote down the name, Julian. Just the name, the date, and the fact that she didn't know I'd been eavesdropping. Then I closed the notebook and stared at the box for a long time. I didn't know what I was waiting for. October arrived, and the nature of the pressure changed, like the familiar tension before something is about to collapse. Vance's visits to the shop became more frequent than ever. No longer a drop-by. He came with a purpose that was less disguised than it had been in the summer. He started asking about asset valuation. Not directly. Vance never did anything directly. He approached the topic the way you approach a dog you aren't sure about, sideways, slowly, avoiding eye contact. He'd mentioned how the abandoned warehouse on the corner had recently sold for a good price. How hot industrial property in Detroit was right now. How interesting that was. He'd point out that a friend of his had recently had a professional review his estate documents and found several loopholes that needed updating. He would suggest in extremely gentle wording that perhaps it was worth having someone take a look. Just to clear up the paperwork, Dad. Just to relieve you of your administrative burden so you can focus on the car repair work you love. The wording was slightly different each time, but the destination was always the same. He was testing which way encountered the least resistance, like a thief picking a combination lock, turning one number at a time, listening for the clicks. Each conversation ended the same way. I agreed it was worth considering, and Vance left with a look of faint satisfaction. And after he left, I stood at my workbench and wrote down exactly what he said and at what time. The phone call came on a Wednesday in the second week of October. A woman named Patricia. She'd been a clerk at the Wayne County Probate Court for nearly 30 years, and she and Martha had worked together on the church fundraising committee for a decade. She called the shop's landline at 2:30 p.m., asking if I had a few minutes. She told me very cautiously, the tone of someone doing a favor they absolutely shouldn't be doing from an official position, that an application had been filed. An application requesting the establishment of a conservatorship, the kind of document requesting that the court appoint someone to manage the finances and personal affairs of an individual who might no longer possess the capacity for independent management. She said she couldn't disclose further details. She just felt I should know. I thanked her. I told her Martha always said she was a great person. She said she was sorry, and she meant it. Then we said goodbye. After I hung up, I stood there with the receiver for a while, not out of shock. I'd been mentally preparing for this realization for months. It was more because of the heavy sense of reality that hits when a suspicion becomes a certainty. Suspicion leaves room for doubt. Certainty does not. So this was the architecture of the whole plan. Not just kitchen table talk or signatures, but a court filing. Official, recorded. If left to proceed without resistance, It would hand the legal power to manage my finances, my property, and the decisions about my own life directly to Eleanor and Vance. And this lawyer named Julian was clearly the one providing the legal scaffolding. The stuff in Eleanor's thermos wasn't accidental. It was the physiological groundwork required to ensure a doctor's report could arrive at the conclusion they needed. I was prepared for certain things, but I wasn't fully prepared for how vicious and thorough their plan actually was. I recorded the call in my notebook. Then I went back to work. Julian Reed appeared on an evening in the third week of November. Vance brought him to the house, not the shop. Coming to the house itself was a gesture. He was around 44, medium build, wearing a charcoal suit that was tailored too well to be off the rack. Vance introduced him as a family wealth advisor, not a lawyer, even though he clearly was one. That title immediately told me how they intended to package everything that followed. He held my hand with both of his, right hand gripping, left hand covering. That handshake that lasts 2 seconds longer than necessary. He said it was such an honor to finally meet me. That finally meant Vance had been talking about me for a while. I filed that detail away without comment. His voice was the most unsettling part of him. It was genuinely pleasant, warm, unhurried, and carried an inflection you only develop after years of convincing people to agree to things they hadn't intended to agree to. He didn't say anything offensive that night. He complimented the old house, asked thoughtful questions about the history of the shop, showed a seemingly genuine interest in mechanical restoration, and mentioned his grandmother once owning a 1950s Ford, which she'd always called her most prized possession. I observed him the same way I observed everything, silently leaving no trace. Maya was there that night, too. It was a Tuesday, the day she usually came over for dinner. She sat at the far end of the table, eating with that special quiet she'd had since September. She used to be a barrage of questions at dinner, uninhibited, the way children are when they're completely relaxed. But that fall, the questions stopped. She turned to observing adults, observing the conversation, observing the way people subtly adjusted their posture and voice depending on the audience. At one point, Julian Reed asked her a question about school. Maya answered very politely in 2 sentences, then turned her attention back to her plate. A few minutes later, I glanced at her and found her looking at Julian Reed with an expression I knew very well. She was measuring him. After they left, Maya helped me clean up the table without a word. We washed the dishes in that easy silence we'd built over the last year. When I walked her out to Vance's car, she stopped on the front step and turned around. The porch light was behind me, so I couldn't see her face, but I could tell she was calculating something in her head. Some thought or question she hadn't found the right words for yet. She stood there for 3 or 4 seconds. Then she wrapped her jacket tighter, got in the car, and didn't say a thing. Whatever it was, she decided to keep it to herself. I watched the taillights until they turned the corner and the street returned to silence. Back inside, I sat in the armchair in the living room. Martha's chair, the one she'd always claimed was the most comfortable in the house, the one I'd avoided sitting in for the last 3 years, though I'd never truly admitted why. I sat in it that night because I was tired of avoiding things. For the first time in a span of years I couldn't easily measure, I felt truly isolated. It wasn't the kind of bearable loneliness I'd felt for the past 3 years. I'd made peace with that kind of loneliness. This was a raw, bloody sense of isolation. A man under siege, unable to say a single true word to anyone around him. Not one. Not even to the girl with her grandmother's eyes, who was quietly learning to be afraid of something she didn't yet have a name for. I sat in that chair for a long time. By early December, everything was already in motion. The pieces were in place, and now they were just waiting for the right moment to close the net. Vance called it planning for the future. I called it measuring the curtains before the funeral. December arrived in Michigan the same way it always does. Gray, insistent, and relentless. The winds tore across Lake Erie, turning the half-hearted sleet of autumn into storms that carried a sharper, more malicious bite. The city pulled inward, and people hurried along the sidewalks. Shop windows were dressed in lights and garlands, trying to manufacture a sense of warmth, and for the most part, succeeding. For 43 years, I'd hung a small wreath on the door of Pendleton Classics every December. I hung one again this year. Sometimes you keep doing things not because of the sentiment, but because of a belief. If you maintain the normal long enough, the normalcy itself becomes a kind of armor. Vance called on December 3rd. He used his usual opening, asking about Maya, about Smith, about whether there were any interesting restorations in the shop for the holidays. 5 minutes of carefully calibrated conversational filler. Then he got to the point. He said he'd been thinking about how much I had to manage on my own lately. The shop, the house, the finances. It's too much for anyone, he said, let alone someone at your age. He wasn't suggesting anything dramatic, just a temporary arrangement, a limited power of attorney, so he could assist with some administrative tasks during the holidays. Things get complicated and stressful this time of year, and you should be able to enjoy the season worry-free, without having to fuss over paperwork. In that conversation, he used the word temporary 4 times. I counted. I told him it was a thoughtful idea and that I'd give it serious consideration. I chose the word serious because it lets the other person feel heard, while committing you to absolutely nothing. Vance said he was pleased and that Julian had actually already drafted a simple, straightforward document we could go over together. He said there was no rush, but if I wanted to have everything settled before Thanksgiving, it might be worth sitting down in the next week or two. No rush. Before Thanksgiving. I wrote both phrases down after I hung up. Julian Reed called twice in the first week of December. The first time was Tuesday morning. He said he was just following up on Vance's conversation with me, wanting to ensure I didn't have any questions about the documents he'd prepared. His voice was the same over the phone as it was in person, smooth, unhurried, like water finding the path of least resistance. He mentioned the document was truly simple, that he'd drafted similar arrangements for many families in my situation, and that it was something that could provide peace of mind. I told him I appreciated the call and was still evaluating my options. The second call was Friday afternoon. This one was short. He said he was just checking in to ensure I had everything I needed. He reminded me that his schedule was flexible over the holidays and that I could see him whenever I liked. He said he hoped I was well and that he was very much looking forward to seeing me at Thanksgiving dinner. I had never invited him to our Thanksgiving dinner. I chewed on that detail for a long time after the call ended. By the second week of December, the outline of their timeline was clear. The application for conservatorship that Patricia had mentioned was still pending, waiting for a hearing date in the court system. But if I signed a voluntary power of attorney before that hearing ever happened, Vance wouldn't need a court ruling. A voluntary document signed by a man who appeared of sound mind and free will would grant Vance essentially the same power, faster, cleaner, and without the scrutiny that comes with a contested court proceeding. Thanksgiving dinner was the trap. The family gathered together, the holiday spirit making everything feel soft, with Julian Reed present, bringing his pleasant voice, his well-tailored suit, and that truly simple document. In this business, if I couldn't recognize a classic closing strategy, I'd have lived a wasted life. Maya came to the shop on a Thursday afternoon in mid-December. She walked in as usual, dropped the cello case, took the rocking chair and pulled out her sketchbook. But she was different that day. She drew for about 20 minutes and then stopped, something she almost never did. She stared at the paper for a moment, then set the pencil down and turned to face me. "Grandpa," she said, "are you okay?" It wasn't the guarded, measuring look from the previous month. This was a direct question with the seriousness only a child possesses, when that child has decided the adults around her aren't going to volunteer the truth. I looked at her across the workbench. At 12 years old, sitting in the chair that once belonged to her grandmother, she asked me a question no one else in my life had dared to ask directly. I said I was fine. She stared at me for a moment, the way children do when they're deciding whether to accept an answer or push further. Then she said, "Okay." She picked up her pencil and went back to her sketchbook. She didn't believe me. I could see that clearly. And the thing I couldn't tell her, the thing I had to carry alone while she did her math homework 3 feet away, was that I didn't fully believe myself either. Not about whether I was fine, but about whether I was ready. They were two different things, and I was confusing them more and more often. That night, after Maya left and Smith locked up, the shop was quiet. I sat at my workbench with my notebook open. I wrote down Julian Reed's name, the dates of the two calls, and the exact phrasing he used each time. I wrote down Vance's language from the third, temporary administrative assistance, peace of mind, and the fact that he'd already told Julian I'd be sitting down with him soon before I'd even agreed to it. I wrote down Julian's phrasing about the holidays, that uninvited, looking forward to seeing you. Then I closed the notebook and set the pen down. They thought I was waiting, frozen by confusion, inertia, or the slow intellectual erosion they'd been carefully orchestrating since July. They thought the man sitting behind that workbench was exactly the person they were trying to mold him into. They were wrong about that. They were wrong from the very beginning. I wasn't waiting. I was preparing. There's a fundamental difference between the two, and in the near future, I'd be very grateful that they never understood that. November 27th, 2025, Thanksgiving. I woke up that morning knowing exactly what was going to happen. I just didn't know it would come from a direction I couldn't possibly have anticipated. The house was filled with the scent of coffee and roasting turkey. It was still Martha's tradition. Even though she wasn't here, I followed her recipes, working in the kitchen by muscle memory and 50 years of experience instead of reading a cookbook. The turkey went in at 7 a.m. The mashed potatoes were kept warm. Maya arrived at 9 o'clock, dropped off by Vance on his way to run an errand. That was perfect for me. It meant I had almost the entire morning alone with her, which turned out to be the best part of the day. She burst in wearing her coat, immediately starting a critical assessment of the living room decor. I handed her a box of old Thanksgiving decorations and stayed out of her way. We were together all morning. She rearranged the room with the focused energy of someone with very specific aesthetic standards, while I moved between the stove and the kitchen counters. Maya found a playlist on her phone, one of those old-school holiday jazz stations. She set it on the counter, and suddenly the kitchen was filled with sounds that were both familiar and distant. When you've heard certain songs too many times, they stop being just music and start carrying the weight of the years they've collected. Sinatra, Nat King Cole. The morning was lovely. I want to be clear about that. Whatever happened afterward, that time was truly lovely. The kind of ordinary, unremarked upon loveliness you don't fully appreciate while you're in it. Only in comparison afterward does it seem incredibly precious. At 5 p.m., Eleanor and Vance arrived. Vance was in high spirits, the brightness of someone who believes everything is going according to plan. He brought fine wine and wandered through the kitchen with the ease of someone who had already mentally claimed this house as his own property. Eleanor was quieter than usual. She hugged me when she arrived, which she didn't always do, and her eyes swept the room in a way that was definitely not a casual glance. Maya retreated to a corner of the living room with a book, a new development. She used to love hovering near the adults at family gatherings. This year she had clearly decided that keeping some distance was the most reasonable reaction to an odd atmosphere she couldn't yet clearly articulate. Julian Reed arrived at 6:17 p.m. Vance introduced him again as a family advisor, sticking to the frame from November, with the same practiced ease. Julian shook my hand, held it for 2 seconds too long, and said some warm things like, "What an honor it is to be invited on such a wonderful evening." He brought a bottle of red wine that was much more expensive than the one Vance had brought. I noticed, but said nothing. The four of us circled each other in that pre-dinner lull, with the polite, guarded tension of people waiting for something to happen but not wanting to look like they were waiting. Vance asked about the shop. Julian Reed asked thoughtful questions about the history of the block and the house. Eleanor moved between the kitchen and the dining room, setting the table with a quiet efficiency, which would have looked helpful if I hadn't been noticing exactly what her eyes were tracking. But I had been noticing. It was while Eleanor was moving through the kitchen, she was reaching for the serving platters in the cabinet above the fridge, that I walked to the counter to check the stove and passed by the kitchen table. The folder was sitting at the far end of the table, half hidden by Vance's coat. He'd left the coat there when he arrived, draped over the back of a chair. The folder had been under or inside the coat, but over the last hour, part of it had slid out. An ordinary manila folder, the kind you buy at any office supply store, with a white printed label. Pendleton Asset Transfer Authorization, November 27th. I read it in the time it took to take one step. I didn't stop walking. I didn't change my expression or my pace. I checked the stove as I'd intended, turned the heat down slightly, and returned to the living room. For 5 months, I'd been practicing those tiny, unnoticeable movements. This was the most important one yet. At 7:30, everything was on the table. The turkey, the mashed potatoes, and the almond green beans made the way Martha always had. The wine was poured. The candles were lit. Maya had insisted on the candles. She'd found the old brass candlesticks in the sideboard drawer and polished them herself that afternoon without being asked. Vance sat at one end of the table. Julian Reed sat to his left. Eleanor sat across from him. Maya sat next to me, close enough that her arm almost touched mine. The clock on the wall showed 7:42 p.m. I looked around the table. Everything was in its place, and everyone was in the positions they'd arranged. The room was warm, the candlelight was steady, and the food on the table was getting cold. The way food gets cold when people wait for something to happen before they pick up their forks. I picked up my knife and fork. The doorbell rang. For a split second, nobody moved. Then I set my silverware down, pushed back my chair, and went to answer the door. I don't know what I expected to see when I opened the door, but it certainly wasn't him. The first thing that rushed in was the cold, like a wall, that sharp, damp Detroit December cold, which had become incredibly bitter over the last hour. Where the porch light couldn't reach, the street was pitch black, and it was pouring rain, the drops looking almost like snow under the streetlights. Standing on the front step, just at the edge of the porch roof, was a man. He was in his 30s. It was hard to be more precise. Cold and exhaustion leave their own marks on a person's face, and his face had clearly seen a lot of both lately. He wore a dark work jacket, enough for the weather it was designed for, but definitely not enough for tonight. His shoulders and cuffs were soaked. His hair was matted by the rain, and he hadn't shaved in days. But his eyes. That was the first thing I noticed before the jacket, the hair, or anything else. His eyes were tired, the genuine fatigue of someone who hasn't slept properly in a long time. But they were also incredibly, disturbingly alert. There was nothing unfocused about them. He was sizing me up with a quiet precision I recognized, though I couldn't immediately place where I'd seen it before. He said he was sorry to bother me. He said he'd been walking for a long time. The storm had worsened much faster than he'd expected, and he wondered if he could stay out of the rain for a bit, wait for it to let up, and if it were possible, have something to eat. He said it simply, without performance, without the practiced cadence of a professional beggar. He was just stating facts and making a request, and he was prepared to accept any answer. I watched him for a moment, then opened the door wider and told him to come in. Vance had already stood up by the time I turned to head back to the table. He said, "Dad," in that tone people use when they want to stop something from happening without explicitly stating what that something is. I told him to sit down and go get another chair from the hallway closet. He lowered his voice, speaking with the gravity he thought he was projecting, saying we didn't know this man and that this probably wasn't a good idea. I said I was well aware we didn't know him. That's the general situation with strangers. I went to the kitchen to get another plate. Eleanor said something about safety, about not knowing who was out on a night like this. Her voice sounded reasonable and concerned. It would have sounded genuinely concerned if I hadn't spent the last 6 months cataloging everything about Eleanor that looked sincere but was actually deceitful. I didn't respond to that either. Julian Reed said nothing. He turned to watch the man walk in from the cold, remaining in that turned position, observing with a look of extreme caution. He was assessing something. I didn't know what yet. Smith had told me years ago that you learn more about a person in the first 30 seconds after an accident than in a year of normal conversation. What I learned in those 30 seconds was, Vance's first instinct is control. Eleanor's is anxiety, whether real or performed, and Julian Reed's is assessment. The man sat in the chair Vance had reluctantly retrieved from the hall. At my suggestion, he took off his jacket and hung it on the back of the chair. The jacket was too wet, leaving a dark water stain on the wood. He put his hands on his lap and watched the dinner table with a posture of extreme restraint, the kind you see in people who have learned never to occupy more space than they've been given. I served him food from the dishes on the table: turkey, potatoes, green beans. He thanked me in a calm, even voice and started eating. He ate slowly, without awkwardness, without performing gratitude, just eating at the pace of someone who had long ago stopped treating the speed of eating as a social issue. The way he ate was the way someone who had truly been starving, but had learned to control that hunger so as not to be consumed by it, would eat. I'd seen this trait in people who had spent long periods in desperate straits and could only maintain control over the smallest things. Maya sat across the table, studying him with the kind of unadorned focus children have before they learn what's considered rude. The others at the table rearranged themselves into a facade of a normal dinner. Vance asked Julian about a development project. Eleanor poured wine into her own glass, and the conversation continued over the head and around the stranger at the end of the table, like water flowing around an obstacle. I didn't join the conversation. I watched the man. Halfway through the meal, without taking his attention away from his food, he reached into the inner pocket of the wet jacket hanging on the chair behind him and placed an object on the corner of the table, right next to his plate. A cell phone, old model, worn edges on the screen. The case was an incredibly mismatched pale pink, the kind of case you only see on a phone bought second-hand or handed down by someone else. He had it wrapped in a thin plastic bag, like the kind you use for produce at a grocery store, tied at the top with a rubber band. The bag had a layer of mist on it from the warmth of the room. He set it down the way you set down something you want to keep an eye on, unobtrusive, just within reach. Maya looked at the phone, then at the man. Then, with the bluntness I'd come to see as her most reliable quality, she asked, "Are you a policeman?" The man looked up from his plate. He studied Maya for a moment, not the fleeting, dismissive glance adults give children when they're answering a question they don't take seriously, but a real pause, as if the question deserved to be taken seriously. Then he said, "I've done things like that before." Maya nodded, clearly satisfied. She picked up her fork. I noted the answer. I noted the phone. I noted the way the man looked at Maya, with attention, with a kind of recognition that might have identified a trait he respected. I filed it all away silently, making no comment, because that's what this particular moment required. And then I started to notice, using that keen peripheral vision you train yourself to have when observing things, that Julian Reed had become very stiff. He was staring at the cell phone on the corner of the table. Then his gaze shifted to the man sitting next to it. It was an extremely cautious, tightly controlled look. If you were only watching casually, you'd never catch the panic. But I'd been observing Julian Reed for 2 months, and I knew what his relaxed expression looked like. This was definitely not it. A subtle but unmistakable flash of recognition crossed his face, like he'd seen that face somewhere before, and he absolutely hadn't expected to see it again. For the first time all evening, Julian Reed looked completely uncomfortable. The first mistake Julian Reed made happened exactly 11 minutes after the stranger sat down. I knew it was 11 minutes because I'd been watching the clock on the wall above the sideboard, not in the obvious way you let others know you're watching, but with the peripheral habit of a man who'd spent a lifetime doing precision cutting and polishing. Dinner resumed in a peculiar way. Plates were passed. Wine was poured. Vance steered the conversation back to Troy real estate prices, and Julian Reed followed along with the focus and pleasure that were clearly his default setting. The stranger ate quietly, saying nothing. At the 11th minute, Julian Reed set his fork down, reached into the leather briefcase he'd leaned against the chair leg when he arrived, and pulled out a folder. Not the manila folder I'd seen on the kitchen table. This one was newer, the high-end leather display case you buy when you want to make something look well considered, rather than haphazard. He placed it on the tabletop next to his plate and looked at me with the expression he'd been calibrating all night. He said he hoped I wouldn't mind. He knew the timing wasn't ideal, but since we were all here, Perhaps now was a natural moment to take a few minutes to look at something he and Vance had been putting together. Just a simple document, he said. A temporary arrangement that would allow Vance to assist with certain administrative tasks over the next few months. Nothing that couldn't be rescinded. He pushed the folder a few inches in my direction. From the other end of the table, a voice spoke up very pleasantly. What kind of lawyer brings power of attorney paperwork to Thanksgiving dinner? The entire table fell into that silence that only occurs when something everyone hears, but no one is prepared to deal with, hits the floor. Julian Reed looked at the stranger, his face straining to maintain a polite expression, and failing completely. He said something about the holidays being a natural time for a family to gather and discuss planning. The stranger nodded slowly, as if considering the claim. Then he said, "Is that a temporary power of attorney or a conservatorship filing submitted through the court?" Julian Reed's chin twitched before he spoke. "This is a straightforward private agreement." "Because those are two completely different legal instruments," the stranger said, his tone as unhurried as it had been 20 minutes ago when he asked Maya to pass the salt. "A private power of attorney requires the principal to have full legal capacity at the moment of signing. A court-ordered conservatorship follows an entirely different procedure. I'm just curious which one this is, because your methods seem to have mixed the elements of both." The pretending to eat dinner act had come to a complete halt in the room. Vance shouted the man's name. No, not his name, because no one at the table knew it yet. Vance shouted it a sharp, clipped, "Hey!" in an attempt to signal that the stranger had no standing here and should know better than to speak up. The stranger looked at Vance with a gentle, sincere interest, as if Vance had said something worth studying, rather than a warning meant to silence him. Then he looked back at Julian Reed. "When was the conservatorship application filed with the Wayne County Probate Court? Because if it's already in the system, then having your client sign a private document tonight is, I'm not a lawyer, but I believe the term is irregular." Julian Reed closed the folder. It was a tiny, practiced, and highly controlled movement, but it was an absolute admission of guilt. If that document were truly what he claimed, simple, benign, something any reasonable family would have ready for the holidays, the reaction to that question should have been an explanation, or at the very least, a defense. Closing the folder itself was an answer, and everyone at the table understood it, even if only one person understood the legal logic behind it. I stood up. I want to be precise about what I said and what I didn't say because it matters. I didn't accuse anyone of anything. I didn't mention the hidden folder I'd seen on the kitchen table, the pending court application, or the months of careful observation I'd conducted behind everyone's back. I just stood up. At my age, in my own house, that movement carried a weight that needed no explanation. I said I would not be signing anything tonight. Not the document in the folder, not any document. Not because I was talked out of it by anyone at the table, but because this was my decision, and I had already made it. The matter was closed. Then I looked at Julian Reed and told him I thought it was time for him to go home. He stared at me for 3 seconds. I counted them. Then he picked up his briefcase, said his goodbyes with the kind of stiff, formal politeness that you'd realize was no different from contempt if you knew the truth, and went to the front hall closet for his coat. I heard the front door open and close. I didn't go to see him out. I sat back down. Maya was looking at her plate with the cautious neutrality of a child who had realized far more than the adults in the room intended for her to know, and decided that staying still was the best response. Her fork rested at a precise angle on the edge of the plate, the posture of someone who had finished eating and had been sitting with that fact for a while. Vance's face had turned the specific shade of a man whose contingency plans had just completely dissolved. He sat straight, the way people do when they're trying to project control over a situation that's already spiraling, but failing to manage it. His wine glass was in front of him, but he hadn't touched it in a long time. Eleanor looked at Vance. Vance looked at the cell phone on the corner of the table, the pale pink case still wrapped in a plastic bag, resting where the stranger had placed it an hour ago. Through the entire dinner and everything that followed, its owner hadn't mentioned it once. For a long time no one spoke. The candles had burned down an inch since we sat. The food on the table turned from warm to cold. In that patient, indifferent way, food changes when people wait for something else to happen before they start eating. Outside, the rain continued to beat against the glass, steady, unhurried, as if it had nowhere else to be. When Vance and Eleanor took Maya upstairs to rest, I asked the man if he wanted some tea. He said yes. I brewed 2 cups of black tea, real black tea with nothing extra added. It was the first time in months I'd brewed tea for someone in this kitchen without having to carefully consider what I was putting in it, or what someone else might have added. The difference was obvious, even if I was the only one who could feel it. We sat at the clean kitchen table. The good plates were stacked by the sink. Outside, the rain continued its steady conversation with the windows. The house was quiet, with that specific silence of people pretending to sleep. It's different from real sleep. It's closer to holding one's breath. I'd lived here long enough to tell the difference without thinking. I placed his cup in front of him and sat across from him. "Your name," I said. Not a question, just the first order of business. He wrapped both hands around the cup, like those who still need to remind themselves to accept warmth. He looked at the cup for a moment, then at me. Marcus Hayes, 34, former forensic accountant for the SEC's Detroit office. 6 years until I was fired. He stated it plainly, not softening the word, and not using the euphemisms people usually look for. I appreciated that. In a major case, I documented a pattern of internal malfeasance. I reported it through the proper internal channels. But the channels ultimately decided that the most effective solution was to deal with the person who kept the records. He said this without a trace of bitterness. I found that more convincing than if he'd shown it. Bitterness is a performance for an audience. What he carried was the steadiness of someone who had examined a thing from every angle and accepted it for exactly what it was. Yeah, but after that, I applied for an independent auditor's license in Michigan. As long as you have the background and no record outside of being fired, the process is simple. I've been working independently for 3 years. And Vance? I asked. He nodded. 18 months ago, a former colleague reported suspicious fund flows in several accounts linked to a commercial real estate firm to me. Your son-in-law is a partner in this firm. The pattern fits wire fraud, money washed through a series of intermediary accounts to hide its source and destination. Every transaction is calculated to avoid automatic review, but over time, the cumulative amount is massive. He placed the phone with the pink case on the table between us. Everything I've collected is backed up and encrypted separately. This phone is just an access hotspot. I have 18 months of financial records, internal communications, and 3 recordings of conversations made where single-party consent is legal in Michigan. It's enough. You chose tonight on purpose, I said. I was close enough to the trap and had been for long enough to know they had a hard deadline. If the documents were signed tonight, their legal position would change drastically. Harder to challenge, harder to overturn. He paused. Before I knocked on that door, I also needed to confirm one thing. Whether you were completely unaware of what was happening to you, or if you had an idea. Now you know, I said. Now I know, he replied. We sat in silence for a while. The storm raged outside, a strong gust pressing against the glass, then releasing. There was no movement upstairs. I looked at the man across the table. Marcus Hayes. I turned the name over in my mouth, like you turn over a piece of rusted metal, before deciding exactly what part it is. Then I said, your uncle's partner was Elias. The stillness that flickered across his face was tiny but unmistakable. It wasn't surprise. It was something older than surprise. It was recognition. You knew my uncle, Marcus said. He taught me the craft, I said. I spent 9 years in his shop before I opened my own. He was the kind of mentor whose words you wouldn't fully understand until years later, and then you'd never be able to stop thinking about them. Everything I know about patience, about precision, about looking at something for a long time to see its essence, rather than what you hope it is, came from him. Marcus was silent. He slowly rotated the cup with both hands. When his shop was in serious financial trouble, I was busy expanding my own business. That's the hard truth. He called twice. I listened both times, said the empty words I was supposed to say, and then didn't show up. He died 2 years later, and I found out from someone else 2 weeks after the fact. I wasn't looking for absolution. I was just stating the facts, without the personal filter I'd allowed myself to use for 23 years. He mentioned you, Marcus said after a while. Not often, but when he did, he wasn't angry. He said you were the best apprentice he ever taught, and that you just did what ordinary people do when their own lives become too loud. I set the cup down. The kitchen was filled with the silence that settles when something that should have been said a long time ago finally is. It wasn't uncomfortable, nor was it empty. It was the silence of a room that had finally cleared enough space to hold what it was truly meant to carry. What I owe Elias is a debt I can't repay in this lifetime, I said. He didn't tell me I was wrong. He didn't say it didn't matter. He looked at me with those steady, unhurried eyes, the way his uncle looked at people, I realized now, and nodded. I asked him if he wanted to stay the night, not because I needed the assistance. I could have handled the work I'd been doing for the last 6 months on my own, and I had the capacity to keep going. It was because there was a debt I'd carried since the spring of 2002 that I'd never been able to find a place to repay. And sitting across from me at this kitchen table was the only person in the world who could allow me to repay a portion of it. I asked him if he wanted to stay, not for me, but for Elias. The morning after Thanksgiving, I woke up at 5:47 a.m. The house was still pitch black. It was the darkness peculiar to the end of November, about 40 minutes before the gray morning light begins to permeate. Not quite light, just the process of black gradually softening. I lay still for a while, listening. There was no sound upstairs. There was no sound in the living room either, which meant Marcus was either still sleeping on the sofa or awake but very quiet. In either case, there was nothing I needed to do right now. I got up, went downstairs, and started the coffee. There's a wonderful clarity when you're the first one awake in a house full of people who don't know you're watching them. Before anyone walks through it, the room looks different, somehow more honest. In the morning light, the living room was a study of the wreckage left behind from last night. The dining table had been cleared, but the chairs hadn't been fully pushed back. The front hall closet door was still slightly open, the place where Julian Reed had taken his coat. There was a small, dark water stain on the dining chair, a mark left by a soaked jacket that had sat there for 2 hours. Marcus was awake. He was sitting on the sofa, a blanket over his legs, holding that phone with the screen shedding a faint light that illuminated his face. He looked up as I walked in with 2 cups of coffee. For several minutes we said nothing, just the coffee, the morning, and the sounds of the house beginning to wake up. A floorboard creaking upstairs, the old heating system ticking as it started. The building had been occupied long enough to have a daily rhythm all its own. Then Marcus said, "After you fell asleep last night, I checked the property mortgage records." I looked at him. "Your shop is under a lien," he said. "Registered in Wayne County 8 months ago. Pendleton Classics. The building itself, the business license, the valuation of the vintage car inventory. Everything was used as collateral for a $2.5 million mezzanine loan." He paused. "The signature on the application isn't yours." I held the coffee cup with both hands and looked out the back window. The backyard was covered in a thin layer of overnight snow. Not deep, the kind of Detroit early snow that looks real from the inside but disappears by 10 a.m. The rose bushes Martha had planted by the back fence were just showing above the snow, looking bare and angular in the gray light. 45 years. I built that shop with 45 years, just like you build anything that lasts. Slowly, carefully, with no shortcuts, focusing on the things most people think are too small to matter. And 8 months ago, while I was weighing my words and watching my son-in-law's eyes scan my rows of out-of-print engine parts, someone mortgaged it out from under me without my knowledge or consent. I didn't say anything else. The silence contained everything. "This is a federal-level crime," Marcus said calmly. "Forging the property owner's signature to apply for a loan isn't a civil dispute. That's bank fraud under 18 U.S. Code Section 1344. The lender is an FDIC-insured institution, which makes it a federal felony." I nodded. I kept looking at the yard. Maya came downstairs at 7:14 a.m., still in her pajamas. her hair standing up at an angle that suggested she'd slept in defiance of gravity. She stopped at the bottom of the stairs, looked at Marcus on the sofa with the cautious gaze she used to evaluate most things, and apparently decided that having a man sleeping on your grandfather's sofa on the morning after Thanksgiving fell within the acceptable range of anomalies. She headed straight for the sofa and started drawing in her sketchbook. Vance came downstairs at 8:30 a.m. He was dressed up, which told me he hadn't slept as well as he intended to show. He said good morning to me, good morning to Maya, and acted with an indifferent, "This is just a minor annoyance, not a major problem," attitude toward Marcus's presence. He asked if there was any coffee left. I told him it was on the counter. He poured a cup, stood by the kitchen island, and talked to me about Maya's school break, about a new restaurant he and Eleanor had been meaning to try, and about the weather forecast for the rest of the week. Very normal conversation, carefully assembled, and thrown out with practiced ease. He knew one truth. If you fill enough of the space with ordinary words, it's hard for anything else to squeeze in. The folder labeled Pendleton Asset Transfer had disappeared from the kitchen table. He'd taken it sometime between last night and this morning. I noted the absence just as I noted most things. No comment, keeping what I knew and what I chose to show strictly separated in my mind. Eleanor didn't come downstairs until after 11 a.m. She made a brief appearance, brewed some tea, chatted with Maya for a few minutes, and went back upstairs. Around 12:40 p.m., while Maya and I were sitting at the kitchen table, studying a new type of vernier caliper she'd found in the toolbox that she'd never seen before, Eleanor's phone rang somewhere upstairs. A short ring, one or two tones, then dead silence. She didn't answer, or she answered and hung up almost immediately. I couldn't tell which. But 4 minutes later, I could hear her pacing on the floor above our heads, the quality of her footsteps entirely different from before. Maya looked up from the calipers. "Is Mom okay?" "I think she's just tired," I said. She accepted the answer with the patience peculiar to a child. She'd already learned that some adult explanations were just placeholders, not answers. She looked down and went back to the calipers. I looked at the ceiling, then went back to studying the calipers too. That Thanksgiving weekend, I learned something I should have known a long time ago. Quiet does not equal stillness. A place that looks like there's no movement on the surface might have massive movement hidden underneath. They didn't give up. The failure of the previous night had cost them Julian Reed, the documents, and the timeline they'd built around them. But people who had spent more than half a year planning, like Vance and Eleanor, wouldn't change their goal because of one night's error. They would only change their methods. By November 30th, the cracks in their alignment began to show, not to each other, but to me. There was a specific texture to the atmosphere in the house when things went wrong, but no one was willing to say so. Everything continued, cooking, washing dishes, talking, but the texture was different, slightly off, like a bearing that looks correct until you put it under a micrometer, and the deviation from the tolerance becomes visible to the naked eye. I'd been measuring them with a micrometer for 6 months. By the 30th, I could see a lot. The first thing I noticed was the space between them. When Vance and Eleanor moved through a room together before, they always carried the coordinated ease peculiar to two people who had been together long enough, a shared vocabulary of space. Who sat where, who conceded on what topic, who filled the silence, who let the silence continue. But a fault line had appeared in that coordination. They were all small things that weren't worth mentioning individually. Eleanor chose the single chair on the other side of the room instead of the sofa where Vance was sitting. Vance asked her a direct question, and Eleanor's answer was a beat slow, the kind of absent-minded answer you give when your mind is elsewhere. Vance picked up her phone from the counter where she'd left it, didn't look at the screen, just moved it, but stared at her face while he did it. She didn't react, which in itself was a reaction. I noted all of this from the corner of my eye, just as I'd done since July, and said nothing. On the morning of the 30th, Eleanor announced she was going for a walk. On the surface, this wasn't strange. She had a habit of walking and had always been someone who regulated her state of mind through exercise. What was strange was the time. It was 25 degrees Fahrenheit outside, and there was still ice on the sidewalk from the night before. She put on her thickest coat and snow boots, said she'd be right back, and left without waiting for anyone to offer to join her. I watched her from the front window until she reached the corner and turned left, facing away from the direction of the park. That wasn't her usual walking route, and with a clear destination in her stride, rather than the loose pace of someone out for a stroll. I didn't follow her. Marcus did. He was in the kitchen when she left, and by the time Eleanor's car passed the corner, he was out the back door and around the side of the house within 30 seconds. He moved with an unhurried efficiency that only someone who had done this kind of thing too many times, to the point where it no longer required conscious thought, possessed. I stayed by the window, watching the street and waiting. He returned 22 minutes later. He came in the back door, poured himself the last of the morning coffee, and sat down across from me at the kitchen table. He placed his phone face up between us. The screen shed a faint light that illuminated his face. It was a photo. On the corner of 19th Street and Main, outside a small grocery store, there was a dilapidated public phone booth, the kind of fixture most people walk by without noticing. Eleanor had used that phone for 7 minutes. Marcus had taken a photo of the booth itself. There was a small plaque next to the coin slot with a number on it, faded but legible. He'd also taken a photo of Eleanor from across the street, far enough that she couldn't detect him, but close enough to identify her. She was standing with her back to the street, one hand resting on the top of the booth, speaking with a focus peculiar to someone choosing their words extremely carefully. "She didn't use her own phone," Marcus said. "That means she didn't want the number appearing in her call logs. She didn't use the landline at home either, which means she didn't want the call traced to this address." "Who was on the other end?" I asked. "Checking," he said. "The number on the booth gave me a starting point. Anyone can check whether that number dialed out. The question is, who was on the other end of the line?" That afternoon, Vance took his phone into the back bedroom and closed the door. The house was old and the doors were solid, but the way the hallway carried sound was probably something the original builders hadn't anticipated. I was in the kitchen at the time and heard his voice. At first I couldn't make out the words, just the tone, lower than his normal pitch, carrying that incredibly flat texture people use to replace their normal tone when they're saying something they don't want to be overheard. I moved toward the hallway. Didn't go the whole way, just close enough to hear. "We need another way," I heard him say. "He's not signing anything. That road is dead." Pause, listening. Then, "I understand, but the old man isn't going to cooperate, and we can't afford to wait for the court to run the process at its own pace." Another pause. "Just tell me what the other options are." Before he finished speaking, I returned to the kitchen. I didn't need to hear the rest. I'd already heard the core. Vance was still in contact with Julian Reed. They were recalibrating rather than retreating, and whatever happened next would be more than just a document on the dinner table. That night, Marcus checked the number on the booth through the investigative databases available via his private investigator's license. The results came in around 9 p.m. He placed the printout on the coffee table between us, without comment, letting me read it for myself. The number was linked to a prepaid account, the kind you load with cash and discard after use, which meant the trail ended there. However, the phone booth itself had a call record through the operator. The number Eleanor had dialed, after cross-referencing, pointed to a name, a man in his 30s, with a minor criminal record, several light summonses, one charge that had been downgraded and settled out of court. Nothing that could be called a significant felony, nothing that made him look like anything special other than someone who was occasionally hired for cash. The kind of person you'd contact when you needed to get some dirty work done that you couldn't put your name on. I read the page twice, then set it down. Marcus carefully folded the printout, flattened it along the center, and held it with both hands for a moment. "Someone," he said, "is considering doing something irreversible." I didn't make him explain. He wasn't guessing. He was describing a pattern he'd seen in his previous career. The details would become clearer as the situation unfolded. For now, he'd given me the outline, not a complete plan yet, but the motivation for implementing one was already there. I didn't ask any more questions. I understood. January arrived quietly. Vance had been too quiet for too long, which meant he was thinking, and Vance's thinking was always more dangerous than his talking. If you knew what Vance changing looked like, you could have seen it from the first day of the new year. He became very easygoing, not the carefully calibrated easygoing he used when he wanted to achieve a specific end, but a looser, more patient attitude. He asked about the shop with what seemed to be genuine interest. He offered to help with chores around the house. At the breakfast table on January 2nd, he laughed at something Maya said. The warmth was such that for a second it was like the laugh of a man who wasn't running an algorithm in the background. I watched all of this from the same distance as I had for the last 6 months, and recorded it in the same notebook. I would never mistake it for anything other than what it was. This was a man who had decided to wait rather than push, because pushing no longer worked. I just didn't know yet exactly what he was waiting for. On the morning of January 4th, Vance told Eleanor he had a meeting across the river and left the house at 9:15 a.m. Marcus had developed the habit of knowing where people were going before they arrived. Vance's car hadn't yet backed out of the driveway before Marcus was out the back door and around the block. I stayed home. 40 minutes later, Marcus called from a phone booth, the irony of which wasn't lost on either of us. "A cafe on Southeast Hawthorne," he said. "He and Julian Reed have been there for 35 minutes. A table by the window, either carelessness or confidence. I've been to the bus stop across the street. Can I hear anything?" "No, but I took photos." About 8 minutes ago, Julian Reed opened a folder. Vance pointed to something inside. They talked for 4 minutes, and then Julian wrote something down. It wasn't a transcript, but it was enough to confirm that the arrangement between Vance and his lawyer hadn't ended at Thanksgiving dinner. Whatever Julian Reed had written down, it definitely wasn't a bill for services already rendered. Marcus returned at noon. On his way back, he stopped by the County Administrative Records Office, a habit from his previous job. Before drawing conclusions from non-public information, check the public records. He placed 2 pages on the kitchen table. One was a photo of Vance and Julian Reed at the table by the window, their heads bent over the same document. The other was a summary of an independent legal document he'd found in the public records. It was a declaration of limited participation signed by Vance, dated December 30th. The document described his role in certain family financial planning discussions as advice only, and defined all substantive decisions as being made by his spouse, Eleanor. Eleanor didn't know this document existed. I was quite sure of that, because the Eleanor I'd been watching for the past week in no way acted like a woman who had just agreed to take full responsibility for anything. "He's separating himself from her," Marcus said. "As of December 30th, on paper, he's just along for the ride." I read the document twice. Extremely detailed work. The kind of thing that looks like routine administrative paperwork until you understand the positioning, and then you gasp. "And Eleanor," I said, "is still making phone calls she doesn't want traced." "Yes," Marcus said, "which means whatever she's arranging, she hasn't told Vance. And Vance is insuring himself against whatever she might be arranging, which means he suspects what she's going to do." "And he suspects correctly," I said. "Yes," Marcus said, "he guessed right." But 2 days later, I was following my routine of an afternoon nap in the armchair in the front hall. I'd kept up this habit since August, because consistency in the small details is the key to making a performance convincing. I wasn't asleep. I was listening. Vance came downstairs at 2:40 p.m. His footsteps moving through the house carried the ease of a man who believed he was alone. The way he checked the rooms was casual in appearance, but not in reality. He walked to the front hall entrance, saw me sitting in the chair with my eyes closed, and stood there for a moment. Then he moved down the hallway toward the living room. I heard him move something, a very small thing, on the shelf next to the bookcase. That shelf held a few framed photos and a few pieces of craftwork Martha had bought in a Santa Fe market in 2009. Then he went back upstairs. I got up 20 minutes later, and Marcus told me, with the casual tone of someone telling me the mail had arrived, that Vance had just been in the living room. Marcus reached under the shelf and felt out a small black rectangular device, about the size of a matchbox. It was a small, voice-activated recorder, the kind of consumer-grade device you can buy in any electronics store. He placed it on the kitchen table and looked at it without touching it again. "Michigan," he said. "Two-party consent," I said. He nodded. "Michigan criminal law, recording private conversations without the consent of all parties involved, is a criminal offense." Vance had placed a recording device in my home, in a room where private conversations frequently took place, without the knowledge or consent of anyone using it. He'd placed it to collect evidence against Eleanor, but the act itself was evidence against him. I walked to the tool cabinet and brought back something that looked similar, a small portable timer I'd had in the junk drawer for years, about the same size, and handed it to Marcus. He placed it in the same spot under the shelf, at the same angle, and in the same direction. Then he handed the original to me. I took it to the bedroom and placed it in the metal safe in the closet, right next to the August lab results, the notebook, and the copies of the documents Marcus had gotten from the county records office. That night, I wrote a line in the notebook. January 6th. V and E are no longer cooperating. They've begun to turn against each other. I closed the notebook. The recording device lay silently in the dark safe. It would eventually become evidence, just as everything eventually becomes evidence. Only when Vance pressed it into the bottom of the shelf that afternoon, in a house he believed belonged to him. He never imagined what kind of evidence it would become. For 42 years he never understood. There is a world of difference between a house you live in and a house you own. It happened on a Thursday morning, 3 blocks from the shop, at 8:14 a.m. I know the exact time because I checked my watch at the corner of 13th Street and Hoyt, a habit formed from decades of opening the shop at the same time. And I noticed I was 4 minutes ahead of my usual pace. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of January day Detroit occasionally gets between long periods of gloom, the air carrying a sharpness that made everything look clearer than it really was. I was thinking about a clutch repair job I hadn't finished the night before. I wasn't thinking about the alley. That alley cut between 2 buildings on the north side of Hoyt Street. It was a narrow service passage that nearby restaurants and shops used for deliveries. For 40 years, I'd probably walked past it 240 times a year. It had never caught my attention. I heard the engine before I saw the car. Sudden acceleration, the sound of tires gripping the slick asphalt, coming from the left and already moving fast. Too fast for my body to react before my ears processed the information. I fell backward against the red brick wall behind me, hard. It was an instinctive movement, pure reflex, the kind of instinct that didn't ask for your opinion before acting. The car swerved out of the alley, surged across the sidewalk, and slammed heavily into the base of a metal lamppost near the curb. The impact wasn't destructive. The vehicle seemed to have already started decelerating, or the lamppost had changed its trajectory, or both, but the sound was loud and direct, leaving a harsh echo in the air that took several seconds to fully dissipate. Then the car reversed, corrected its direction, and sped along the street. It moved with a speed that was noticeable, but not slow enough to immediately invite the police. I stood with my back against the wall for a moment, my palms flat against the cold brick. Then I straightened my coat, picked up the notebook I'd accidentally dropped, and stood quietly until my heart finished the frantic beating it does when encountering such things, and Man returned to my familiar rhythm and returned to. Less than a minute later, Marcus arrived at my side. He'd been trailing half a block behind, distant enough not to attract attention, and close enough to provide help if needed. He already had his phone out and was looking in the direction the car had disappeared, with the focused and unhurried expression of a man completing a task. "I got the license plate," he said. "Good," I said. We stood there for a while longer. A woman pushing a stroller stopped on the opposite side of the street, looking at the lamppost with the concerned gaze of a bystander who wasn't sure if she should help. I raised a hand to signal I was fine, which seemed to satisfy her. She continued walking. "Are you really okay?" Marcus asked. "I'm 71, I said. "Everything is relative." We walked the remaining 3 blocks to the shop. I unlocked the front door, brewed some coffee, and sat at my workbench. Marcus stood at the counter, using his phone to search that license plate through his investigative database. It took 11 minutes. The registered owner was a man in his 30s, the exact name Marcus had traced when he followed Eleanor to the public phone booth on December 27th. The connection was now direct and documented. Eleanor's phone, his number, his car this morning. I processed this information. Then I thought about what it meant in chronological order. Eleanor had found the recording device under the shelf. Or rather, she'd discovered the swap timer. She would have noticed eventually. She was cautious enough to check. When she found a device that she hadn't watched Vance put there, she would have immediately realized that someone else in the house knew what Vance had done and had decided to use the secret rather than confront him. She didn't know if it was me or Marcus, but she knew her time window had narrowed significantly, and her reaction was exactly what someone who thought their options were being cut off would do: accelerate the implementation of a plan that Vance didn't know about. That night, Marcus went to see that driver. I didn't ask for the details of how he'd arranged the conversation, nor did I ask exactly how Marcus had presented the situation. For a man who'd spent 6 years conducting interrogations in environments far more formal than an underground parking lot meeting, that was his area of expertise. I only know that Marcus left the shop at 6 p.m. and returned at 9:15 p.m. When he came back, he sat down and told me that the man had agreed to provide full testimony to federal investigators in exchange for Marcus's recommendation that his cooperation be considered in subsequent proceedings. He was terrified, Marcus said. Given his situation, it was the right reaction. What did she have him do? I asked. My voice remained steady because some questions must be asked in a steady voice, regardless of what you're thinking inside when you ask them. She told him that the old man walked that route every morning, Marcus said. She told him it just needed to look like a hit and run. She told him that if he succeeded, a thick envelope would be waiting for him. If he failed, she'd never seen him in her life. I looked at the workbench in front of me. The repair piece I'd been thinking about all morning was still there, a linkage for a small Ford carburetor that needed to be refastened, nothing complicated. I picked up the appropriate wrench, then set it back down. Contact the people you know, Marcus said. It wasn't a question. I walked to the back room and picked up the landline receiver. I dialed the number I had memorized 15 years ago. It was from back when Pendleton Classics had provided the FBI with edge case, perfectly legal assistance in dismantling a smuggling and money laundering network that had been utilizing vintage cars across the Midwest. The agent I'd worked with back then had climbed very high in the organization since, which was either a good sign or a complicated signal. But his private line still went through. He picked up on the third ring. I told him what I had. Not everything, just the architecture of the case. It was enough to make him understand the scope, the timeline, and the nature of the crimes. Wire fraud, mortgage fraud, a court filing that misrepresented material facts, a documented attempted murder disguised as an accident, and a compromised witness already in hand. After I finished, he was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Give us 3 weeks." I said, "You have exactly 3 weeks." 3 weeks. I had 3 weeks to ensure there was no way out for them. In my line of work, the final stages before a restoration is complete are often the most demanding. It isn't because the remaining steps are technically difficult. By that stage, the hardest mechanical decisions have already been made. It's because the margin for error has shrunk to almost zero, and every choice carries the weight of all the effort that came before it. You walk slowly, you double-check. You never rush the things that cannot be undone. The 18 days from January 10th to January 28th felt exactly like that. Marcus spread everything out on the wide workbench in the back room of the shop, the only place large enough to hold the fruit of 18 months of careful evidence gathering. I closed the shop early every day that week, pulled the front blinds, and in the peculiar quiet of the shop after hours, we checked it off item by item. First were the financial records, 18 months of transaction data related to the 4 intermediary accounts linked to Vance's commercial real estate partnership. The money had moved in carefully calculated small increments, none of them large enough to trigger an automatic bank review, but each one, once traced, pointed to the same source. Over 3 years, The pattern of transfers, totaling $380,000, was entirely consistent with money laundering as described in 18 U.S. Code, Section 1956. Marcus had secured the original account documents, transfer records, and a forensic audit summary prepared by a former IRS analyst. She'd gone into private practice. Marcus said she'd checked the numbers twice and described them as rock solid. Next were the mortgage documents, records from Wayne County, the forged signature on the application, the loan proceeds, and the lien forcibly placed on the shop without my knowledge or consent. Marcus had obtained certified copies from the public record. The original signature comparison would be completed by the FBI's own document examiners, but Marcus had already had a handwriting analyst look at the preliminary photos. The conclusion was clear. Then came the trust documents. Maya's irrevocable trust was established in 2019, initially funded with $200,000 and steadily growing through careful management. As the name suggests, an irrevocable trust cannot be modified or withdrawn without the trustee's consent. The trustee was a trust officer at a Detroit financial institution who had been appointed when the trust was established, and there were no records of any authorized withdrawals. The $140,000 withdrawn over the last 14 months had been taken using a forged authorization of my guardianship signature. Vance's schemes had been collapsing and needed cash to fill the gaps, so he'd found a way to extract the funds, evidently assuming no one would notice until it was too late. But someone had noticed. "This one," Marcus said, placing the trust folder at the top of the pile, "will be the most damaging to a jury." I knew what he meant. Wire fraud and money laundering are financial crimes, serious and indictable, but as abstract as numbers on a page. An education trust fund established by a grandfather for his 12-year-old granddaughter, being hollowed out by a stepfather using forged signatures over 14 months. That isn't abstract. That is a story a jury can feel in their gut. The final piece of evidence was provided by Vance himself. The recording device he'd hidden under the shelf in my living room, the one Marcus had swapped for a junk drawer timer, had run for 6 full days before Vance retrieved it. In those 6 days, it had captured 3 phone calls Vance made from the living room when he thought he was alone in the house. One of the calls was to Julian Reed. In it, Vance discussed the December 30th declaration, using language that described Eleanor's role as dominant, while characterizing himself as peripheral, and toward the end of the call, lowered his voice to mention the situation with the old man might require a solution different from the one we initially discussed. Michigan is a 2-party consent state. Recording private conversations without the consent of all parties is a criminal offense. But Vance had personally placed that device in my home without the knowledge or consent of anyone using the room. What I had done was simply save what it captured. My lawyer, whom I'd quietly consulted by phone in the second week of January, confirmed that the recordings were admissible. The device was Vance's, the placement was Vance's, and the conversations took place in my residence. Whatever evidentiary complexities might arise, those were problems for Vance to deal with. On January 25th, a Sunday afternoon, we met with the FBI in a small suite in a commercial office building downtown. I suspect that place was used exclusively for meetings of this nature and nothing else. The agent I'd spoken with on the phone was there, along with 2 other agents. Marcus brought a briefcase full of documents. I brought the recording device in a sealed envelope. The meeting lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. It was mostly them asking questions, Marcus answering, and me answering the ones that required me. Finally, the senior agent, the one I'd known 15 years ago who looked far more tired than I remembered, told me they had enough. "We need a few days to process the search and arrest warrants," he said. "Federal judge, probable cause, affidavit, standard procedure." I told him I understood. On the night of January 29th, he called the shop's landline. All warrants had been signed. The operation was set for Friday night, the 31st. "We'll be waiting outside," he said. "When you're ready, when everyone is in the room, and when that recorder starts running, turn on the porch light. As soon as we see the signal, we move in." I told him I understood. After hanging up, the shop was quiet after closing, I sat at my workbench for a while. The street outside was pitch black and damp, the way Detroit streets look in January, the streetlights reflecting off the pavement and looking entirely like something else. I reached for the shelf behind the row of books and took down the box. I opened it on the workbench, took out the Shelby GT 500 tachometer from the dark velvet, the one Elias had given me in a paper bag 23 years ago. I'd never fixed it. I'd looked at it many times, always putting it back. I placed it under the workbench lamp. The light shone through the scratched glass onto the frozen needle and oxidized brass parts. It wasn't the luster of a finished product, but something more fundamental. Potential. Potential trapped in a broken form, waiting for the decision to be awakened. I wrapped it carefully and put it in my jacket pocket. The porch light. 2 more days. I made beef stew. The detail might seem small, but it wasn't. Beef stew was Martha's signature dish. 3 hours in the oven, carrots cut thick, a splash of red wine in the gravy. She always insisted it made a difference, though neither of us could ever say exactly what that difference was. I hadn't made it since November 2022. On the morning of January 31st, I stood at the counter, peeling carrots over the sink, and thought about that. Not about what would happen tonight, just about the carrots. Maya came over at noon. I'd told her to come early, telling her I needed help setting the table. She knew something unusual was happening. Children always know, but she didn't ask. She folded the napkins into rectangles, the way Martha used to, instead of the triangles most people folded, and placed each fork with the careful precision her grandmother had possessed. When she finished, she looked at the table for a moment, then looked at me. "Do you want me to stay in my room tonight?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "Thank you for that." She nodded. No arguing, no questions. She took her plate to her room at 5 p.m., closed the door gently, and I didn't hear a sound from her for the rest of the night. That child. She was always wiser than I gave her credit for. Marcus had been in the house since morning. He sat in the living room with a cup of coffee and an unopened folder. He was in the armchair, facing the hallway and the front door. He wasn't hiding. If anyone asked, he was a friend whose apartment was being painted, staying over for a few days. We'd discuss this. No one would ask. Vance and Eleanor arrived at 6:15 p.m. Julian Reed arrived 12 minutes later, alone, carrying nothing but his coat. He looked around the room as usual, classifying, assessing, and then settled into the chair at the far end of the dining table with the ease of a man who believed he still held some kind of advantage. Dinner was almost normal for a while. I served the stew. I poured the water. I asked Vance about a property in Oakland County he'd mentioned in November, and he rattled on for several minutes with the fluency of a man who'd rehearsed it many times. Eleanor ate quietly, her fork moving in small, controlled motions. Julian Reed complimented the food twice. I thanked him both times. By 7:30, the plates were mostly empty. I set my fork down, picked up my water glass, took a slow sip, and set it back on the table. Then I reached under the table on my side and placed 2 items on the surface. A small recording device, the one I'd taken back from the living room shelf 3 weeks ago, and a manila folder thick enough to speak for itself. The dining table went silent. "Before we discuss the future," I said, keeping my tone level, "I want everyone to listen to something." Julian Reed's eyes shifted toward the recorder. Vance's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Eleanor looked at her plate. I pressed play. The first recording was from early January, the cafe on Southeast Hawthorne. There was the kind of background noise that causes sound to travel in a specific way. Vance's voice was clear. Julian Reed's was even clearer. The conversation covered the pragmatic, unhurried details of how to reorganize a set of documents, to shift the primary legal liability for a series of financial decisions onto a third party. That third party was Eleanor. Neither man mentioned her name, but the framework was specific enough that no one at the table could have had any doubts. Eleanor lifted her head from her plate. She looked at Vance. Vance didn't look at her. The recording played for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. When it ended, I didn't speak immediately. I let the silence do its work. Then I opened the folder. "These are certified copies," I said. "Bank filings from the Wayne County records, and an irrevocable trust document established for a minor beneficiary." $200,000 was seeded into the trust. $140,000 was withdrawn 14 months ago, using a signature that was neither mine nor authorized by any court. I placed the folder in the center of the table. There is also a tracking log here, I continued. A traced phone number, a name linked to that number, and a signed, attested statement from the person who agreed to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for leniency. I looked Julian Reed straight in the eye. His expression was that of a man calculating how many exits were in the room, only to discover there were fewer than he'd hoped. The hit-and-run driver, Eleanor said. It wasn't a question. That driver? I confirmed. The room fell into a long, heavy silence, the kind of silence that has weight. I stood up slowly, with the motion of a 71-year-old man rising from the table when he's finished eating, unhurriedly, and said I needed to go to the kitchen for more water. It was the truth. My glass was empty. I walked to the kitchen, filled it at the faucet, and on my way back to the hallway, I reached out and flipped the switch by the front door. The porch light turned on. I returned to the dining table, set the glass down, and sat back in my chair. We waited, maybe 30 seconds, maybe less. The front door opened, not from the inside, but from the outside. Two figures crossed the threshold, their credentials already in hand, their voices calm, professional, and carrying the authority peculiar to people who have a full set of legal documents supporting every word they're about to speak. They identified themselves to the people in the room. They explained why they were here. They were polite. They were thorough. I sat in my chair and watched. On the dining table between the recorder, the folder, and the half-finished glass of water, the beef stew had gone stone cold. Martha always used to say this dish tasted just as good reheated. They took Vance out first. I sat at the table and heard the front door open. There were 2 sets of footsteps on the porch, then the sound of a car door closing. Eleanor was taken out a few minutes later. I didn't watch. I kept my gaze fixed on the dining table, looking at the water glass, the recording device, the folder, and the cold food that no one had touched for the past hour. Julian Reed had already been escorted to a different car before that. That's how the process works when charges involve different jurisdictions and legal counsel. The clock on the mantelpiece pointed to 9:47 p.m. Marcus stood in the doorway between the living room and the dining room, hands in his jacket pockets, looking out through the front window at the street. He didn't say anything. By this time, there was nothing left to say. Then I heard the sound from the stairs, not all at once, only the squeak of the second step from the top. That step had been squeaking since 1987, and I'd never fixed it because Martha said she liked knowing someone was coming downstairs ahead of time. One extremely careful step, then another. Then Maya appeared at the bottom of the stairs, wearing her socks and that gray sweater with the frayed cuffs that she'd fought me tooth and nail to keep from throwing away. She looked at me, at Marcus, at the front door that had closed again, and at the absence of the people who'd been in this house an hour ago. "Grandpa," she asked softly, "is it over?" I crossed the room and sat down on the third step beside her. The wood was cool. I hadn't sat on these stairs since Maya was 4, too small to come down on her own. "The worst part," I said, "yes." She thought for a moment, in the way she thought about most things, thoroughly, without haste. "Okay," she said. We sat there for a while. Marcus quietly gathered his things from the living room, leaving us the space to be alone without us needing to ask. At some point, Maya leaned her head against my shoulder. I wrapped my arm around her, and neither of us spoke again for a very long time. That was enough. Sometimes that is entirely enough. The morning of February 1st was gray and calm. My lawyer's name is Patricia Wren. She had handled my business affairs since 2009. She is a meticulous woman who communicates in short, precise sentences and charges high fees accordingly. She came to my house at 9 a.m. with her leather briefcase and her own travel mug of coffee, for which I was more grateful than I could express. We went through the list. Priority 1 was the mortgage lien. The federal case against Vance included written evidence of the fraud he'd committed in securing the lien on Pendleton Classics, the forged signature, the fabricated notarization, the bank records that wouldn't stand up to scrutiny. Patricia would file a court order with the Wayne County Circuit Court to rescind the trust deed. Assuming there were no complications, she expected the process to take 6 to 8 weeks. I told her to assume there would be complications and to plan accordingly. She made a note of it. The second matter was Maya's trust. The irrevocable trust established for her education had been drained of $140,000 using a forged guardian authorization. Restoring it would require probate court procedures, forensic accounting audits, and coordination with the bank. Patricia told me not to expect that to be simple. I told her that since about July, I'd stopped expecting anything to be simple. She almost laughed when she heard that. The third item was the conservatorship application Vance had filed in October. With his arrest and the pending federal charges, the application was effectively hanging. But Patricia wanted to file a formal motion of opposition and dismissal, accompanied by supporting documentation, so it couldn't be quietly reactivated by anyone acting on Vance's behalf during the legal proceedings. I agreed. We signed what needed to be signed. By noon, we had the outline of a plan. Not a solution. Plans and solutions are two different things, and Patricia was careful never to confuse them, but a direction, a set of steps arranged in a logical order. That was already more than I'd had in August. The new location for the shop was further north on Woodward Avenue in downtown Detroit, about 4 bays smaller than the old site in Corktown and several degrees quieter, but close enough to a great bagel shop that the morning air sometimes blew the scent of fresh baking through the vents. I'd signed the lease last week, back when it still depended on the direction of events I couldn't fully predict. Now chance had been eliminated. I spent the afternoon of February 1st packing boxes. Not everything. I'd arranged for movers to come on Thursday, but the things I wanted to move personally. My private workbench, the extremely expensive OEM toolkits arranged in a specific order, the glass display cabinet holding the 3 small pieces I was most proud of repairing, and the framed photo of Martha and me. That photo was taken outside the original repair shop in 1991, back when the awning was still new, and we were both younger than our children are now. Marcus's office was 2 storefronts away from me, on the second floor of a second-hand bookstore, accessed by a narrow staircase. If you were carrying anything wider than a briefcase, you had to walk sideways. The sign for his door hadn't been installed yet. He told me it was on order, still waiting for the engraver to deliver. I told him I wasn't going anywhere. The FBI had formally recognized his contribution to the case in writing, a letter of commendation from the Detroit office. Marcus folded it into thirds, put it in his desk drawer, and made no comment. I knew about it because I was listed as a supporting reference in the case file, and Patricia had sent me the relevant pages. Elias would have been proud. Not the kind of pride that's worn on one's sleeve. Elias never wore his emotions easily, but in his quiet, concrete way, making you know that what you'd done had landed exactly where it was supposed to. In the evening, when the light passing through the windows of the new shop vanished, the kind of amber hue that Detroit produces on the rare occasion in February when it remembers the sun exists, I sat down at the workbench in the new location for the first time. That car tachometer was in my jacket pocket. It had been there since the morning of January 25th, when I'd set out to meet the FBI, wanting to hold something truly tangible in my hand. I took it out and placed it on the leather pad. The mottled face, the frozen needle, and the weight of 23 years of waiting were all concentrated in that question, no larger than the palm of my hand. "When you're ready," Elias had said, "when you can look at it with the right eyes." I looked at it with the right eyes. I opened the precision toolkit on the right, selected a jeweler's screwdriver, adjusted the angle twice, checked the light from the desk lamp, and checked the angle once more. Behind me, the new space had the silence of a shop waiting to become itself, holding its breath, not yet sure what kind of place it would become. I had some ideas. I secured the gauge. The first move of a disassembly always decides everything. The angle, the force, and the admission that you've understood how the precision part was originally meant to function. You can hesitate for 23 years, but eventually you have to make the move. I turned the screw. The part is imperfect. Even repaired, it will always be imperfect. That is the nature of real things rather than the idealized versions. There will be wear in the internal gears, oxidation marks on the dial that cannot be cleaned away. And in some places, the movement of the needle will never be perfectly calculated or predicted. But it is real. And in my experience, having sat in the same chair for 50 years, watching the mechanical faults others missed, that is almost always enough. I am 71 years old. I've spent half a century in the same chair at the same workbench, looking at rusted parts most people would have dismissed directly. I've cultivated the skill of seeing what others miss, the hidden chassis crack, the corrosion masked by a surface polish, the metal shavings deep in the oil sludge you almost convince yourself don't exist. But somehow I almost missed it in my own house. That is the part that stayed in my mind long after everything had settled. Not the legal proceedings, not the court documents, not even the moment the front door was pushed open from the outside. What stayed in my mind was July. A cup of tea I didn't finish, a question asked too smoothly, the calculation in my son-in-law's eyes that I'd recognized and then convinced myself not to recognize. The warning was always there. I saw it. I just told myself I needed more time, more certainty, more evidence, before I had the right to believe the facts I'd already known. Don't be like me. If the story of this American family can teach you anything, I hope it is this. People who intend to take something from you rarely write their intentions on their faces. They come with goodwill. They come with concern. They use words like planning, care, and future, and they say them in the warm tone you've been listening to your whole life, which is precisely why it's so difficult to hear their real intentions. Please notice these things earlier than I did. Trust the intuition that tells you something isn't right, even if you can't explain why yet. Collect your evidence quietly, and when that moment arrives, it always does, be ready. For me, this was never about anger. I want to be honest about that. This story of an old father's revenge wasn't built on rage, bitterness, or any desire to see others suffer. It was built on patience, on precision, and on the same discipline I applied to every engine I'd ever restored. You don't force a rusted part, you find its grain, and then you make your move. That is what I did. I waited until I understood the full shape of what I was dealing with, and then I fought back with everything I had. I believe God does not allow things to remain hidden forever. What is done in the dark always finds a way into the light, not necessarily on our timeline, and not necessarily in the way we imagine, but it happens. I've lived long enough to know this is true. I've also lived long enough to know that truth, when it finally arrives, doesn't need to be loud to be incredibly powerful. I never wished for this to be my family's story. I had wished my daughter and son-in-law were people I could trust. I had wished for my granddaughter to grow up without ever having to understand what betrayal looked like. I had wished for Martha to still be here, sitting in the chair by the window, telling me I was overthinking things again. But this was the story distributed to me, and I chose to carry it in my hands, carefully, steadily, the way you carry anything that is truly important. Maya still comes to the shop after school. She still sits in the same little chair in the corner. Last Tuesday, she looked up from her sketchbook and without any context said, "Grandpa, I think you do a pretty good job at your work." I told her I was still learning. That is the closest thing to peace I have ever known.